The 2025 NFL Scouting Combine is here, and we look at some players to watch for the Baltimore Ravens. All that and more coming up on Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Oestreicher, Ravens Wire, here with you on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for being here and making Locked On Ravens a part of your day and your first listen each and every single day. We're free and available on all podcasting platforms, including in video form on YouTube, where you can like and subscribe to the channel, and in audio form, where you can follow along and subscribe to wherever you get your favorite podcasts. We're a 5-day-a-week plus more daily Ravens show. We bring you that 5-day-a-week Ravens coverage each and every single weekday. Plus, we do have bonus episodes sometimes on the weekends. We also go live after every single Ravens game and every piece of Ravens big news. Speaking of Ravens news, the NFL Scouting Combine, it is officially here. Drills begin on Thursday, so a couple days away from that, but we will be hearing from both Eric DeCosta and John Harbaugh today, 11 a.m. for Eric DeCosta and 1 p.m. for John Harbaugh. So if you're listening or watching this after that, be sure you listen to this and then go over. We're going to have a live show probably around 1:30 or 2, right around when John Harbaugh finishes speaking, to break down and react to what they had to say. We'll talk a little bit about that in the final part of the show here today, or we'll just dive into what to expect from both DeCosta and Harbaugh on that front. But I do want to dive into players to watch for the Ravens during the Combine, because it's a whole thing where some teams really value the Combine. Other teams don't value it as much and just want to go based off of film or traits or who they like. Some people, it's more so, okay, can we confirm stuff about this guy? So we'll talk offense in the first segment. We'll talk defense in the second segment for players to watch. Both sides of the ball have needs for the Ravens. So let's just dive into that right now, starting on the offensive side of the ball. Not going to go too deep into the quarterback position. I mean, we could talk about some backup quarterbacks, but I think the Ravens are going to not have their focus on that group as much. I mean, certainly they could sign a guy in undrafted free agency. They also have 11 picks, and they could maybe go and get a guy in the 7th round that they could bring in to compete with Devin Leary or maybe Josh Johnson again for that backup spot, depending on what happens there. But let's talk running back first, because I know it's a very controversial position for the Ravens. They have 4 guys on the roster already: and Derrick Henry, Justice Hill, Rashod Ali, and Keaton Mitchell. All 4 guys honestly do deserve snaps in different capacities. Obviously, Henry is the big bell cow there. Justice Hill, really awesome third down back and change of pace guy. Keaton Mitchell, I think, just needed a year. And Rashod Ali, he did provide some special teams value at times for the Ravens. So, you look at that position, you're like, well, where's the spot for a running back? In my opinion, 4 is even too much for the roster. I think they need to make a decision between Keaton Mitchell and Rashod Ali. And if I'm the Ravens, I'm keeping Keaton Mitchell there. But you look at guys like Ashton Jeanty, who is not going to be performing at the Combine. Sam Njoku and I talked about that on our Friday show last week, and he wants the Ravens to go get Ashton Jeanty. That's what Sam said. Now, I love Ashton Jeanty, but I think that spending a first on him when the Ravens have other needs, and I hear what Sam is saying, right? I don't think that, Sam is misguided in his want of Ashton Jeanty. I would love Ashton Jeanty on the Ravens. But I think when you talk about offensive line, when you talk about safety, I think those are positions that if there is a guy there and you also have Jeanty on the board, Jeanty's a generational talent, in my opinion. I know some people are more on the Omarion Hampton train or a couple of those other. This is a good running back class. And that's why also I think that you don't have to force yourself, if you're Baltimore, to take an Ashton Jeanty if there is a star offensive lineman, star edge rusher, et cetera, on the board. So when you look at some of those other players that maybe these teams are watching in the middle rounds that, you're not going to have to spend that big draft capital on, but you could still get a pretty solid player overall, maybe a Cam Skattebo from Arizona State. That's somebody who's a very hard runner. I feel like he could come in and make some level of an impact. Maybe you also look at some other players like a Jordan James from Oregon, who could be a really intriguing running back prospect. But there are so many different guys in that like mid-tier. Even when you talk about like the 5th round, where the Ravens did get Rashod Ali last season, I'm not putting so much stock into that position this year because, again, I think the Ravens could maybe surprise some people. And if Marion Hampton is on the board, maybe they do take him in the 2nd round. I don't think he will be there, but I just think that we're going to see Genty go far before the Ravens pick anyway. Maybe that could be to a team like Pittsburgh. I don't know, but I think the Ravens have other needs that they need to address before they go and look at that running back position here. Wide receiver, there's a very specific type of wide receiver the Ravens need to be looking at, in my opinion, and that is those bigger-bodied wide receivers. So I'm intrigued by a couple guys, especially those players that could maybe fall in the mid-rounds. Maybe, obviously maybe a little earlier than that. Like, for example, look at Alex Williams, who is 6'5", out of TCU. He's a guy that he's just that big-bodied frame. I think his teammate, Jack Beck, could be really intriguing. He's 6'2". Nick Nash out of San Jose State, he's 6'3". Those are the types of players the Ravens need to be looking at here because they don't need another 5'10", 5'11", 6-foot wide receiver. They have that guy in Zay Flowers. They have that guy in Rashod Bateman. Tez Walker is a start in that area, but you're going to have Nelson Aguilar. I assume he's not going to be back with the Ravens. I mean, there's a possibility he is, but we'll see. Tylan Wallace is a free agent. I would expect Baltimore brings him back. So if they don't add somebody in free agency, I would think that maybe they do look to the mid rounds for a wide receiver. They could take a 1st-round wide receiver again. I probably wouldn't advise for that, though, because you have taken Rashod Bateman and Zay Flowers, and you're going to have to find ways to pay those guys in the future. But for now, I think that Baltimore could use, I think they should sign a vet and draft a guy. Like, that's my opinion. So if they let Nelson Aguilar and Tylan Wallace walk, sign a vet, and then draft a mid-round wide receiver, I'm okay with that plan. But they do need to get some more behind both Flowers and Bateman, and hopefully Tez Walker can take a step for them in 2025. But I would like to see them add another bigger-bodied player. In fact, just a big-bodied player to that wide receiver room. So those are some of the guys I'm looking at. I know a lot of people, when you talk about the wide receiver position, there are a couple of guys that we're going to see go in the 1st round. I know it's not like the strongest wide. It's not like the draft where, the Ravens were planning on maybe getting a wide receiver with maybe James Williams, Garrett Wilson, Drake London, et cetera. All those guys went, hey, it worked out for them, though. They got Kyle Hamilton, and that's that. But I think one guy that's interesting, and a lot of people are pointing to this guy, and the Ravens, they have been a team that's looked into those Georgia guys. And if you know a Georgia wide receiver, I think a lot of people are looking at Arian Smith, where 2024, he's a fast guy. Again, I don't think that for him, he's going to be a player that the Ravens necessarily need to go out there and target because he is in that 6-foot range. So again, I would rather have that bigger body player, but talent is talent, right? I'm not going to knock the Ravens for taking a talented player, even if it is on the shorter side for wide receiver. But there is that archetype of, I think, what Baltimore needs to be looking for. Now, tight end is really interesting, in my opinion, because you have all 3 guys on your roster right now in the last year of their deal. Mark Andrews, Isaiah Likely, and Charlie Kolar. So you look at that, and do they maybe try to draft a tight end in the mid-rounds and put 4 on their roster this season? I feel like that is a possibility. They have generally only carried 3 tight ends historically recently here, but it's possible because you're going to have to probably choose between Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely after this year if you don't get rid of Mark Andrews. Now, I don't expect them to get rid of Mark Andrews this offseason, if I'm being honest, but is Luke Lachey is somebody out of Iowa that could be an option. We know Iowa, Sam Laporta went to Iowa tight end. I think that he could be an intriguing middle round player. Should they take a tight end on day 1 or day 2? Maybe if the value is perfect, but I'm maybe looking more at day 3 for that position. But I think we all know what position the Ravens really need in the draft on offense, and that is the offensive line. Going to depend a lot on what happens this offseason with Ronnie Stanley, Patrick McCary. If both those guys leave, both those guys walk, maybe one stays, one goes. But I wouldn't be shocked if Baltimore does want to invest in offensive lineman early. In fact, they absolutely should invest in an offensive lineman early to continue. Look, you have your foundational building blocks and Tyler Linderbaum and Roger Rosengarten. We had a conversation on the offensive line on yesterday's show. If you haven't checked that out, Brian Baldinger had some strong words for Baltimore's offensive line. But you have those two building blocks for the long term, at least hopefully. I mean, I'm assuming they're going to re-sign Linderbaum, and down the line, if Rosengarten continues on this path, re-sign him. But could a Tyler Booker from Alabama make sense? I think he's someone I'm really intrigued by. Josh Simmons out of Ohio State probably will be the best offensive tackle in this class. I know Will Campbell's getting a lot of that hype, and deservedly so, but obviously Josh Simmons suffered the injury, and that cost him. And he's someone that I think his stock could be anywhere, but he's a guy that, like, if he's available at 27, are you going to go out there and bring in a guy who did come up, who's coming off of that injury? I think that the risk with Josh Simmons is worth the reward, but the Ravens are going to have to look through the medicals, and that's a whole nother thing with the combine, is like how much teams value drills, how much teams value those medicals, and how much teams just want to look at the film. Do you look at some other players? And I know Baltimore will probably be looking at some of those guard tackle guys who could maybe play, like Gray Zabel, who had a great Senior Bowl out of North Dakota State. He's someone that I think a lot of people are looking at, maybe even in the late first round. I think if Baltimore does want some of those guys, like a Gray Zabel, Donovan Jackson, who can play both on the interior or at the tackle spot, you can have those guys. It's interchangeable. And if they lose Patrick McCary, I think they're going to have to bring in other guys who do have that positional flexibility because, despite the fact that McCary was up and down this past season as a starter, he has been so valuable for them as a rotational piece that can fill in at all 5 spots. And so those guys being able to do that, do you trade back and get an early second-round pick if you fall in love with a guy like Gray Zabel or Donovan Jackson and you feel like you can get him in that range? Are those guys going to improve their stock enough where they are first-round picks by the time that the combine is all said and done? So there are other guys too. Jalen Rivers, I think, is pretty intriguing. And I think Miles Frazier from LSU is someone that a lot of people could figure out, especially if he can improve. For him, it's the movement for guys like Miles Frazier, but that's it. It's like you have to capitalize on your strengths and show to teams that your weaknesses aren't really that big of a deal in order to improve your stock. So I don't think Baltimore's going to be looking at center prospects. I mean, they have Linderbaum, Nick Semick they drafted last year, so I'm kind of excluding that category, but they're not going to be in the conversation for like a Will Campbell, and we know that. But I don't think, look, Tyler Booker is probably out of their range too. I would love it if he fell to 27. Spoiler alert, he's probably not going to. But sometimes, like we saw, Kyle Hamilton, like consensus top 5 guy. But then drills happen, the 40 happens, and teams are like, we don't really like that. And the Ravens said, yeah, okay, we'll take him off your hands, and look at what happened. So it just depends where you think at this point. We're here in February, late February, and we're talking about certain guys as, this guy's a surefire top 15 pick. And then all of a sudden he gets to 22 and you're like, hold on a sec. Could the Ravens maybe trade up for this guy? And I think that if there is a blue chip cornerstone lineman and he's available in the early 20s, Baltimore should absolutely have 11 picks. They should absolutely trade up. And that doesn't go for just offensive linemen. That goes for a lot of other positions too. This to me is the year to be aggressive. This is the year to build on the year you had last season. Disappointing end, but fill out your roster holes, get back, and then be better and go win that Super Bowl. So I think Baltimore has a lot of options, especially on the offensive line, but I would probably say they will draft at least one early and then maybe another one with the mid-round pick. So I'm predicting probably 2 offensive linemen, and hey, maybe we see both of those guys be combine standouts. Coming up in the second part of the show, though, we'll flip over to the defensive side of the ball. Obviously, the defensive line, edge rusher position is a very big conversation point there, but what about the secondary? Stay tuned. We got a lot coming up on Locked On Ravens. Back here on Locked On Ravens, Kevin Oestreicher still here with you on this Tuesday. The combine officially here. Drills start on Thursday. We talked about some players to watch on the offensive side of the ball for the Ravens, but let's now flip over to the defensive side of the ball. And as I mentioned, as we were heading into the second part of the show here, everybody's talking about building up the trenches. Offensive line, absolutely. Defensive line, absolutely. I think a guy that I am 1,000% watching here is Mike Green out of Marshall, someone who improved his stock a ton at the Senior Bowl, put up 17 sacks last year at Marshall, and he's not someone that is going to like wow you in the size department, but he's someone who has the speed. He plays violently, and I think we saw that in some of the viral reps that happened during the Senior Bowl. But the juice that he has as a pass rusher, I think, is absolutely perfect for the Ravens. But here's the thing. Mike Green already improved his stock. I think people, instead of that, oh, is he a second-round guy, day two, he's now firmly in that at least a late first conversation, in my opinion. Maybe very, very early second, but I'd be floored if that were to be the case. If Mike Green goes out there, has a great combine showing, he shows off athleticism, and, you know, I know some of the testing numbers might not wow for Mike Green in terms of some of the traits he has, but he's someone that you can't overthink it. And that's what we kind of talked about with Kyle Hamilton in the first part of the show, is teams overthought that with the 40-yard dash and how Kyle Hamilton didn't have that wow time. So, oh, he must not have the long. I mean, how many times does a player have to run in a straight line like that? Like usually if a safety has to run in a straight line like that, it means they're chasing a guy for a touchdown. There were so many other good things with Kyle Hamilton. I think with a guy like Mike Green, you have to go out there and say, hey, look, this guy has a very talented pass rushing arsenal. He's super talented there. He's a solid run defender, not the best in the draft class, but still very, very good. He has spin moves that he can use. His effort is great. I mean, he screams Raven, in my opinion, and he would be absolutely incredible. But you also look at the interior guys, because you might think, okay, well, they have Nnamdi Madubuike, they have Travis Jones. Well, outside of that, Brandon Urban is a free agent. Michael Pierce probably not playing for that much longer. And then Broderick Washington has been a decent disappointment since signing that extension. I probably wouldn't expect him back after that is up. You look at guys like Walter Nolan out of Ole Miss, super lengthy guy. He's a game wrecker, a play wrecker. He can go through gaps quickly. He wins very hard, and that ends up generating a lot of penalties. And you can also look at some of the other edge players like a Shamar Stewart out of Texas A&M. I think a lot of people, and I know some people are very, very high on Shamar Stewart, like top 10, top 15. Other people are more like late first, early second. So that's where this combine, these drills, depending on how teams feel about the drills and just the measurements and whatnot, will be able to, I guess, better place a guy like a Shamar Stewart, who, look at the dynamic ability that he has. And it's not like he's been this guy. Like, you look at Mike Green and his production, 17 at Marshall. Shamar Stewart only had 4.5 sacks in 3 seasons, right? That to me is a little misleading. And I know other people have said the same thing, but the talent is there, and you can't just go based off of stats. I mean, look at Owe. He didn't have a sack in his final season at Penn State, and he has turned into a solid player, right? He's not the best pass rusher in the world, but he has the traits, he has the athleticism, which again is when you look at these RAS scores, and that'll certainly be a thing here. Baltimore, they have gone through that a little bit where they do target athletes. Now, not all the time. Guys like Isaiah Likely didn't have a huge RAS score, which for those who don't know means relative athletic score, and it factors in the combine drills like 40-yard. It factors in their height, weight, length, arm length, whatever it may be, and they put all that together into a relative athletic score. You look at the highest guy on the team right now based off of that chart, and it actually, well, I'll actually read off the last two. It's Dafe Owe is the best RAS guy, 9.92 out of 10. Trenton Simpson, 9.84. Tez Walker, 9.76. Ben Cleveland, 9.62. Marlon Humphrey, 9.54. Those are your top 5. I said I was going to read out 2, and I did 5. But then you look at some of the lowest guys on the roster: Daniel Falele, Patrick McCary, Tylen Wallace, Isaiah Likely, Ardarius Washington. So it's not like that is the be-all, end-all. But some teams value it a lot more than others do. So some people just look at stats. Now, I know the teams look at a lot more than that, but that is something that some teams do factor into their equations. So for Shamar Stewart, if you look at those 4.5 sacks in 3 seasons, I think you're overlooking a lot of the other talent that a guy like that has, and maybe the combine will answer that potentially. It certainly could happen. Now, other players to look at, I think a couple of mid-round guys will be interesting to watch, especially on the defensive line, where this is such a deep class. It is an incredibly deep class where you're looking at guys like a Darius Alexander, who had a great Senior Bowl. We talked about him on our mock draft yesterday, where he just went out there and balled out, absolutely balled out, and improving his stock at the Senior Bowl. Well, if he does that again at the Combine, could Darius Alexander move up from a third round, fourth round guy? Maybe he's a second round guy. And again, a very deep defensive line class. Jordan Phillips out of Maryland, we've talked about him too. Could he be another option? Kenneth Grant is someone who is probably, look, everybody, the Michigan defensive line there, those two players in terms of Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant, they're going to be really good. But is Kenneth Grant a guy that is going to be able to improve his stock? And could the Ravens be interested in him if he falls into Baltimore's range? So they're going to have a lot of options. And even on the edge, like if they want some of that inside-outside versatility, I know Jalon Walker is probably not going to be there at 27 out of Georgia, but there are other guys. And one player that I think is really, really intriguing, and I feel like more and more hype towards Baltimore is coming up with him. Jihad Campbell is a guy that I think that with him being allowed, the thing with him is he is definitely more of an off-ball guy now. He started off as an edge guy, but he has now moved into that other role. I don't know if Jihad Campbell's someone that if he's at 27, he's like that, okay, running the card up for him, but he's still a player that I think that is going to be considered if he's there for multiple different reasons. And that is due to the versatility, because the Ravens like that versatile inside outside guy. That's not just offensive line, that's everywhere. You talk about corner safety versatility. So when you start getting into those secondary guys, obviously we've talked a lot about Malachi Starks here on this podcast. I don't think he's going to be there at 27. So could Xavier Watts out of Notre Dame, you get that Irish to Irish connection with Kyle Hamilton and Xavier Watts? He's a guy that probably is a second, day two type guy right now, but could he move up if he has a good combine? You look at some of the other good players in this draft. I think that both Kobe Bryant and Mello Dotson out of Kansas, corners there, just because the Ravens have Marlon Humphrey and they have Nate Wiggins doesn't mean they're not going to be in the market for a corner. I think that they could be in that market for sure. And then you can also look at other guys like RJ Mickens, who I think is a really intriguing player. Other guys, I know Upton Stout is getting a lot of conversation. Noah Williams out of California, someone we talked about yesterday. So it's not just about the first round prospects. This is an entire process. Eric DeCosta loves his draft picks. Again, 11 draft picks is a lot of draft picks. So being able to move up, and I know that the thing that stuck out to me about Eric DeCosta and what he's had to say in interviews, and one of the big lines he said is if they are linked to a player, that player might not be on their radar. So just because a guy gets linked to Baltimore doesn't mean he's automatically on their board of guys they are absolutely in love with. So every team has the board. Every team takes the combine a certain level of serious or not, but it is a way for teams to, if it's not look at guys and evaluate their fits for their team, at least get confirmation whether they do fit or not. So a lot of great prospects. Obviously, there are some other guys that we didn't mention here today, but we're going to dive into a lot of that, especially as we get into the drills that start on Thursday, and we'll dive into some of the biggest winners of the combine, losers of the combine, and what that could mean for the Ravens moving forward. Coming up in the final part of the show, though, John Harbaugh, Eric DeCosta, both speaking to the media today. We'll talk about what to expect coming up on Locked On Ravens. Back here on Locked On Ravens, Kevin Oestreicher here with you, talking Ravens football. Eric DeCosta is scheduled to speak to the media at 11 a.m. today, as well as John Harbaugh at 1 p.m. So again, if you are listening to this show right here, right now, before we're going to talk about some expectations here. And if this is after that 1 p.m. window, John Harbaugh has spoken in, DeCosta has spoken in, you can watch this back, hear how on or off I was about what was going to be said, and then go over. We're going to have a live show later today in the afternoon, probably around 1:30 2 p.m. Eastern time after John Harbaugh speaks, or react to what Eric DeCosta said, or react to what John Harbaugh said as well. What do I expect out of these interviews? Well, I think that we should definitely get this out of the way first because it'll definitely be the biggest topic of conversation. And unfortunately, is not going to be the draft. I think that the Justin Tucker situation is going to be a major topic on both of these press conferences. I think there are going to be multiple questions asked to both John Harbaugh and Eric DeCosta about it. The Ravens have not made a formal social media statement. They have made a statement that they have released through, just different reporters. And that statement is held true throughout the allegations that have come out about Justin Tucker. So this is the first availability for Eric DeCosta and John Harbaugh since the whole thing came out, since the whole story broke about Justin Tucker. So I think that is going to be a headliner point here, probably questions, if there are, about, what are your thoughts on the situation? Are you looking into replacements? Could there be a change at kicker? Do you have confidence in Tucker, this, that, and the other? But there is a world, and I don't know how likely or not this is, but I do want to put the possibility out there. There is a world where Eric DeCosta walks up to that podium, says something about the Tucker situation, and says, I'm not answering questions about it outside of this. I think we heard that. I can't remember if it was Harbaugh or DeCosta. I can't remember what situation it was. It might have been Lamar's contract. I think it might have been Lamar's contract. Now that I'm thinking about it, don't quote me on it, but I think I remember that. I've tried to honestly block a lot of that out of my brain, but I think we've heard that before, where there was like a general statement made from either Harbaugh or DeCosta, and then it was, okay, we're not answering anything related to that. And I think that if they do that with Justin Tucker in this situation, that's not what I personally would do. I don't necessarily expect them to do that, but there is a possibility that it happens. Now, outside of the Justin Tucker situation, I think there are going to be questions about different positions they're looking at. Obviously, I think there are going to be questions about the offensive line, maybe confidence in Daniel Faalele. The possibility of re-signing Ronnie Stanley and Patrick McCary will be big. Looking at the secondary, especially with how they performed last season, I think there are going to be questions about their confidence level, maybe some questions about Chuck Pagano and the rest of the coaching hires, Anthony Levine, et cetera, that has been made to John Harbaugh's staff. Maybe a question about Derrick Henry. Obviously, Lamar Jackson is going to be a topic of conversation as well. There's no way these press conferences go by and there's not a question asked about Lamar Jackson to both John Harbaugh and Eric DeCosta. Maybe there are some questions about other extension talks with Henry and then maybe a Hamilton, a Linderbaum. Those are other guys that I would expect there to be some questions about as well. I don't know how long these are going to run, but it's going to be interesting because there also might be questions about, particularly for Eric DeCosta, about, okay, well, you have the 27th pick. Are there any possibilities that they might trade up, trade back? That could be a question that gets asked. Maybe needs, free agents. I don't really think that'll be a huge thing that gets asked, but we'll probably hear some insights, and obviously we'll react to it on Locked On Ravens. Obviously, I'm recording this, and I have no idea what has been said or how that all has transpired yet, but I'm excited to hear what they have to say, and I'm intrigued to hear what they have to say about the Tucker situation because there are a lot of different ways that those questions from both John Harbaugh and Eric DeCosta could be answered and honestly probably will be answered. So this is a big thing for Baltimore. And I think when you look at just how the Ravens have approached the combine and how other teams approach the combine, I want to kind of round it out by saying that, yes, some teams overthink it. There's been especially as, analytics have developed and other things as well. You put guys, they call it the underwear Olympics, right? That's, we'll have Qadri Ismail on later in the week and he'll call it that. That's kind of what it is here. Q and I have talked about it before where it's just like you're going through all this stuff, you're talking to teams, that and the other. One thing could, take you off a team's board. And that could be something as simple as like Kyle Hamilton, you don't run the 40-yard dash as fast as people thought you would. And all of a sudden, you go from this consensus top 5 guy to a top 15 guy based off of something that probably isn't going to matter much in a game setting. And, okay, well, yes, athleticism matters and drills matter, but how much do they matter? I don't think as much as other teams And I think Baltimore doesn't fall into the trap as much. They understand that, hey, the combine is a great way to further evaluate players, but it's not the be-all, end-all. Some teams do take it as the be-all, end-all, and I don't think that's the right way to approach it at all. So we'll talk about who performs well, who doesn't. Mentioned that before, and I'm really excited to dive into all that here on Locked On Ravens. So that's all I have for you here today on Locked On Ravens. Today on the way out, hit the like and subscribe button in video form. We have the new thumbnails rocking out in video form. Really excited about those. In audio form, follow along and subscribe to the channel wherever you get your podcasts. Again, we'll be back here later today, right around 1:30, 2 p.m. Eastern time to break down what Eric DeCosta and John Harbaugh had to say during their press conferences. So be sure to stay tuned for that. I'll see you right back here later today on Locked On Ravens.